The morning fog clung thick to the Belgian countryside surrounding Antwerp as Technical Sergeant Robert Kincaid climbed the metal ladder to his 90mm anti-aircraft gun emplacement. It was December 28, 1944, and the Allied port city had become the lifeline for the entire Western Front. Through the mist, he could hear the distant rumble that had become all too familiar, the pulse jet engines of German Wohn flying bombs approaching from the northeast. But today, Kincaid carried something different. Cradled carefully in his arms were artillery shells, whose nose cones bore an innocent-looking device no bigger than a milk bottle. Inside each fuse sat a miniature radar transmitter and receiver, powered by vacuum tubes so delicate they seemed impossible to survive the 20,000 G-force of firing. Yet, somehow they did, and what they accomplished would transform the mathematics of aerial warfare forever. Kincaid had been briefed on the new ammunition just 3 days earlier. The officers called them VT fuses, variable time, though everyone whispered the truth. These were proximity fuses, shells that would detonate themselves automatically when they sensed an aircraft nearby. The technology seemed almost magical, a shell that could think for itself, reaching out with invisible radio fingers to touch its target, then exploding at precisely the right instant to shower it with deadly fragments. What German pilots flying towards Antwerp that cold December morning could not know was that they were about to encounter a weapon that would make their carefully practiced evasion tactics obsolete. For centuries, anti-aircraft gunnery had been a game of prediction and luck. Gunners calculated where an aircraft would be seconds in the future, set a mechanical timer on their shell, and hoped. The aircraft that survived did so by being unpredictable, by jinking and weaving, by exploiting the mathematical uncertainty inherent in time-delayed detonation. The proximity fuse eliminated that uncertainty, and with it, the scales of aerial combat were about to tip decisively against the Luftwaffe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To understand the revolution that proximity fuses represented, one must first grasp the desperate problem they were designed to solve. By late 1943, the war in the air had reached a technological stalemate. German aircraft, particularly the formidable Focke-Wulf 190 and the legendary Messerschmitt 109, could fly faster and higher than most Allied fighters could effectively engage. The Luftwaffe's medium bombers, the Heinkel 111 and the versatile Junkers 88, could strike Allied positions with devastating effect, often at night when visual interception was nearly impossible. American anti-aircraft artillery, despite its impressive specifications, struggled with fundamental physical limitations. The 90mm gun, standardized in March of 1940, was a powerful weapon. Its shells weighed 23.4 pounds and could reach altitudes of 34,000 feet, traveling at an initial velocity of 2,700 feet per second. When directed by the sophisticated SCR-584 radar system and the M9 director, these guns represented the cutting edge of anti-aircraft technology. Yet, for all this precision, the guns faced an intractable problem. Even with perfect tracking data, even with instant calculation of lead angles and shell flight times, the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire depended entirely on one unpredictable element, the mechanical time fuse screwed into each shell's nose. These fuses, marvels of precision clockwork, had to be set manually before loading. A fire control computer would calculate the exact number of seconds until the shell should reach the target's altitude, and a specialized machine would adjust tiny gears inside the fuse to that precise interval. The system worked, after a fashion, but it required that the target maintain a predictable course and altitude. Any evasive maneuver, any sudden climb or dive or turn, and the shell would explode harmlessly in empty sky. Worse, the mechanical fuses themselves were prone to failure. Temperature variations affected their timing. Humidity could cause the delicate clockwork to seize. Even under ideal conditions, roughly 10% of time fuses simply failed to function at all. Lieutenant Commander Werner Hoffmann, piloting a Focke-Wulf 190D9 on a reconnaissance mission over the Ardennes in early December 1944, had learned to read the patterns of Allied anti-aircraft fire. The black puffs of exploding shells appeared in clusters at specific altitudes, forming what pilots called flak boxes, zones of airspace thick with shrapnel. An experienced pilot could observe these boxes forming, note their altitude, and simply fly around or between them. German tactical doctrine emphasized this predictability. Luftwaffe intelligence had thoroughly analyzed Allied anti-aircraft capabilities. They knew the effective ceiling of various gun calibers. They knew the typical burst patterns. They knew that time-fused shells posed minimal threat to an aircraft that maintained irregular altitude changes. This knowledge informed everything from bomber attack profiles to fighter evasion tactics. Captain Henry Morrison commanded Battery B, 501st Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, positioned along the approaches to Antwerp. His 4 90mm guns, mounted on their M2 carriages, represented nearly 200,000 pounds of precision machinery. Each gun could fire 25 rounds per minute when operated by a well-drilled crew. The automatic fuse setter rammer on the M2 model had revolutionized loading procedures, allowing his crews to maintain sustained fire for extended periods. Yet Morrison had watched, day after day, as German aircraft evaded his perfectly aimed shells. The radar tracking was flawless. The ballistic calculations were precise, but the aircraft simply refused to cooperate with his fire control solutions. A Heinkel 111 bomber, tracked perfectly for 10 seconds, would suddenly drop 2,000 feet. Morrison's shells, timed to detonate at the bomber's previous altitude, would explode uselessly above it. By the time his crews could recalculate and fire again, the bomber had completed its attack run and disappeared into the clouds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The frustration extended beyond individual batteries to theater-wide operational concerns. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in Europe, had watched German aircraft inflict painful losses, despite massive investments in anti-aircraft defences. The breakthrough at Normandy had succeeded partly because overwhelming air superiority had been achieved through fighter sweeps and bomber attacks on German airfields. But achieving that superiority had cost thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of aircrewmen. In the Pacific, the United States Navy had discovered a partial solution to this deadly equation. Beginning in January of 1943, proximity fuses had been deployed on 5-inch anti-aircraft shells aboard cruisers and destroyers. The results were immediate and dramatic. The USS Helena, cruising off Guadalcanal, had downed a Japanese dive bomber on January 5, 1943, using just 3 shells fitted with the new fuses. The bomber had been evading when hit, a kill that would have been nearly impossible with time-phased ammunition. Throughout 1943, proximity-phased, anti-aircraft fire in the Pacific had accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire, despite representing only 25% of shells fired. The effectiveness ratio was stunning, approximately 4 to 6 times better than conventional time fuses. Admiral William Halsey credited the fuses with saving hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors' lives. Yet, despite this proven effectiveness, the War Department had forbidden the use of proximity fuses over land. The reasoning was sound. If a shell fell to Earth unexploded, German scientists might recover the fuse and reverse engineer it. The technology was considered so sensitive that Allied commanders were willing to accept higher casualties rather than risk its capture. This policy held firm through the invasion of France, through the bitter fighting in the hedgerows, through the race across the continent. American anti-aircraft crews continued to rely on time fuses and visual tracking, accepting effectiveness rates that seemed increasingly inadequate as German aircraft adapted their tactics. Then came June of 1944, and with it, a new threat that would finally break the embargo on proximity fuses. The Von flying bomb, Germany's vengeance weapon, began falling on London. These pilotless cruise missiles, powered by pulse jet engines, flew at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. They followed pre-programmed courses, making no evasive maneuvers, simply driving straight toward their targets with mechanical determination. British anti-aircraft defences, arrayed along the coast in a defensive belt nicknamed Diver Strip, initially struggled to intercept the V-1s. Time-fused shells, set for specific altitudes, worked reasonably well against targets that maintained constant height. But the V-1's high speed meant that even a slight error in timing would result in a miss. During the first week of the Vosne campaign, only 24% of missiles entering the coastal gun belt were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The British government, facing a weapon that threatened civilian morale and industrial production, authorized the use of American proximity fuses in 90mm and 3.7-inch anti-aircraft shells. The fuses had to be modified for these Army guns, as the original Navy designs were calibrated for 5-inch naval weapons. Scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory worked around the clock, rushing new variants into production. By the end of June, proximity-fused shells were arriving at British coastal batteries. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. In the second week of July, the destruction rate climbed to 40%. By the third week, it had reached 63%. By the end of August, 79% of V-1s entering the coastal gun belt were being destroyed. On the campaign's final day, radar detected 104 V-1s approaching the English coast. 90mm guns firing proximity-fused shells destroyed 68 of them. Only 4 reached London. Technical Sergeant William Chen, a fire control specialist with a British anti-aircraft regiment, recorded his observations in letters home that would later be declassified. He described watching a Vosne approach at dusk, its pulse jet engine creating a distinctive orange glow. His battery's radar locked onto the target at 8,000 yards. The automatic fire control system began tracking, feeding corrections to the 90mm guns. The first shell left the barrel with a sound like ripping canvas. Chen couldn't see the shell arcing through the twilight. But 2 seconds later, a brilliant flash appeared directly in the Vosne's path. The proximity fuse, sensing the missile's metal body, had triggered its detonation at the optimal distance, 30 feet. The shell's 23 pounds of high explosive converted instantly into thousands of steel fragments, each travelling at supersonic velocity. The fragmentation pattern, carefully designed through months of testing, created a lethal sphere approximately 60 feet in diameter. The Vosne, struck by dozens of fragments simultaneously, disintegrated. Its warhead, jarred by the impact, detonated prematurely. The wreckage tumbled into the English Channel, adding to the growing underwater graveyard of Hitler's vengeance weapons. What impressed Chen most was not the destruction of a single target, but the transformation in his crew's effectiveness. Previously, shooting down a Vosne required coordination, luck, and often multiple batteries firing simultaneously. Now, a single gun could achieve kills with 3 or 4 shells. The mathematics had shifted fundamentally. Instead of hoping their shells would explode at exactly the right moment, gunners simply had to get shells close to the target. The fuses handled the rest, but the Vosne campaign, dramatic as it was, represented only a prologue. The real test would come with the Luftwaffe itself, with manned aircraft capable of radical evasion, flown by pilots who understood air combat at an intuitive level. And that test was approaching rapidly, as autumn gave way to winter in 1944. Adolf Hitler, watching his Western Front crumble under the weight of Allied material superiority, conceived one final desperate gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, would throw Germany's last reserves against the Americans in the Ardennes. The attack, launched on December 16, 1944, achieved stunning initial success. German armour punched through thinly held American lines, creating chaos and threatening to split the Allied armies in two. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Supporting this ground offensive would require air support, something the Luftwaffe could barely provide after years of attrition. Yet Hitler demanded it, and the Luftwaffe commanders scraped together what they could. Focke-Wulf 190s from fighter wings across Germany, Messerschmitt 109s pulled from training units. Even a handful of the revolutionary Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters, machines so advanced they seemed to belong to another era entirely. German pilots briefing for these missions received intelligence that was simultaneously reassuring and dated. They were told that Allied anti-aircraft capabilities remained essentially unchanged from earlier in the year. Radar tracking was formidable, yes, but the shells themselves were predictable. Maintain irregular altitude changes. Avoid straight and level flight near known gun positions. Accept that some aircraft would be lost to lucky hits, but trust that aggressive evasive maneuvering would bring most pilots through. Nobody mentioned proximity fuses because German intelligence had no idea they existed. Colonel George Axelson commanded the 406th Artillery Group, positioned to support the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Monschau, Germany. When the German offensive exploded across his front on the morning of December 16th, he found his lightly armed cavalry troopers desperately calling for help. Axelson's guns could provide that help, but doing so would require using ammunition that had just arrived, still under strict security restrictions. The shells, marked with cryptic codes and accompanied by special handling instructions, carried proximity fuses. Eisenhower had not yet authorized their use over land beyond the Vosne defenses. The restriction made sense from a security standpoint, but seemed increasingly absurd as German infantry advanced through American positions. Axelson made his decision quickly. The emergency superseded the restrictions. He ordered his batteries to load the new shells and begin firing. Minutes later, proximity-fused 90mm shells began exploding over German assault formations. The effect was catastrophic. Unlike time-fused shells, which had to detonate at precisely preset altitudes, proximity shells detonated themselves automatically 20 to 30 feet above ground. This created optimal airburst conditions, showering attacking infantry with fragments that tore through equipment and flesh with ruthless efficiency. German soldiers, veterans of years of combat, recognized something new and terrible was happening. Traditional artillery airbursts required skilled observers and precise timing. In winter weather, with low clouds and limited visibility, such fire was rare and relatively ineffective. But these shells were exploding perfectly, regardless of weather conditions, regardless of visibility. The mathematical precision seemed impossible. Company commanders radioed frantic reports back to headquarters. American artillery had acquired some new capability. Casualties were mounting faster than expected. The assault battalions, already operating on tight timetables, were falling behind schedule. Some units, shaken by the devastating accuracy of the airbursts, began refusing orders to advance. Eisenhower, learning of Axelson's decision, immediately recognized its significance. On December 19th, just 3 days into the offensive, he formally requested that all restrictions on proximity fuses be lifted. On December 21st, the combined Chiefs of Staff authorized unrestricted use of both anti-aircraft and field artillery proximity fuses throughout the European theater. The impact on German aerial operations was immediate and devastating. Luftwaffe squadrons, launching attacks to support the ground offensive, encountered anti-aircraft fire unlike anything they'd experienced. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, flying a Focke-Wulf 190D9 with Jagdgeschwader 2, described the change in post-war interviews. Previously, American 90mm fire had been dangerous but manageable. He'd learned to watch for the characteristic black bursts, note their altitude, and adjust accordingly. On December 22nd, leading a flight of 4 190s on a ground attack mission near Bastogne, Weber encountered something different. His squadron approached at medium altitude, weaving through broken clouds. The American radar picked them up immediately, as expected. The first shells arrived within seconds, also expected. What was not expected was that every shell exploded at precisely the moment it passed closest to his aircraft. Weber watched a shell burst, perhaps 50 feet from his wingman. The fragments, invisible but audible as they tore through the air, shredded the 190's radiator and engine cowling. Coolant streaming back in white vapor, the wingman turned for home, his engine temperature gauge already in the red. Another burst, this one even closer, and Weber felt his own aircraft shudder as fragments punched through his wing. No critical damage, but the psychological impact was severe. The Americans, somehow, were no longer firing where his aircraft had been, or where they predicted it would be. They were firing where it actually was, and the shells were detonating themselves at optimal range. The mathematics that had previously favored the defender had shifted. Evasive maneuvers, the cornerstone of survival against anti-aircraft fire, no longer provided reliable protection. Weber completed his attack run, more from training than tactical sense, and turned for home. Of his 4-aircraft flight, only 2 made it back to base. Both surviving aircraft bore fragment damage that would require days of repair work. The briefing officers listened to Weber's report with visible concern, but offered no explanation for the new weapon he'd encountered. What Weber and his fellow pilots didn't know was that their intelligence services had actually warned about proximity fuses months earlier. German scientists, working independently, had developed several promising approaches to proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition. Designs based on acoustic triggers, on electrostatic fields, on radio frequencies similar to those the Americans used. By 1940, German engineers had working prototypes. Then came the Führer Directive. In the wake of initial German victories, Hitler ordered that all weapons research be focused on systems that could enter production within 6 months. Long-term development projects, no matter how promising, were cancelled. Resources were redirected to immediate tactical needs. The proximity fuse program, requiring extensive testing and refinement, was abandoned. Now, 4 years later, that decision was costing the Luftwaffe dearly. From the lifting of restrictions on December 21, 1944, through the end of March 1945, Allied anti-aircraft guns firing proximity-fused shells destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft over Western Europe. This represented a kill ratio improvement of approximately 4-to-1 compared to time-fused ammunition. Battery commanders reported the change in almost euphoric terms. Captain Morrison, whose crews had spent months watching German aircraft evade their fire, suddenly found his guns achieving kills that seemed almost routine. A Junkers 88 bomber, tracked on radar through thick clouds, never seen by human eyes, destroyed by shells that exploded themselves at the perfect moment. A Messerschmitt 109, attempting to strafe American positions, caught by a single shell that detonated as it passed the fighter's wing, sending it spiraling into the Belgian countryside. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and immediate. Major Gerhard Schopfel, commanding a fighter wing defending Germany against American bombers, later testified to Allied interrogators about the effect of proximity fuses on Luftwaffe morale. His experienced pilots, men who had survived years of combat, increasingly refused to fly low-altitude missions. The risk-reward calculation had shifted too far toward risk. Traditional anti-aircraft fire, for all its danger, followed predictable patterns. A skilled pilot could assess the threat, make decisions, employ tactics that statistically improved his odds of survival. Proximity-fused fire eliminated that element of agency. The shells found you regardless of your maneuvers. They exploded at the worst possible moment with mechanical precision. There was nothing to do but trust in luck and hope the fragments missed your aircraft's vital components. This psychological dimension, perhaps more than the increased lethality itself, contributed to the weapon's strategic impact. Luftwaffe sortie rates, already declining due to fuel shortages and pilot losses, dropped even more sharply. Missions that might have been flown despite the risks were cancelled. Ground attack operations, already dangerous, became almost suicidal. Technical Sergeant Robert Kincaid, returning to his narrative, spent the winter of 1944 through 1945, manning his 90mm gun in the defence of Antwerp. The port city remained Germany's highest priority target. Von flying bombs continued their mechanical assault, now joined by the even more terrifying V-2 ballistic missiles, against which there was no defence. And when weather permitted, the Luftwaffe still attempted bombing raids. Kincaid's battery, positioned along one of the primary approach corridors, achieved a kill record that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. 37 confirmed aircraft destroyed, dozens more damaged and turned back. The battery expended thousands of shells, and the proximity fuses, delicate as they seemed, functioned with remarkable reliability. Failure rates remained below 10%, comparable to or better than mechanical time fuses. The technical achievement represented by these fuses cannot be overstated. Each one contained 5 miniature vacuum tubes, smaller than a fingernail, that had to survive acceleration forces 20,000 times the force of gravity. The tubes had to function at temperatures ranging from 100 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 below zero. They had to operate while spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute as the shell's rifling imparted stabilizing rotation. The radio transmitter, powered by a battery activated by the firing acceleration, had to emit a continuous signal for the shell's entire flight time. The receiver had to detect the reflection of that signal from aircraft that might be hundreds of feet away, discriminate between genuine targets and ground clutter, and trigger detonation at the optimal instant. All this from components that fit in a volume no larger than a milk bottle and cost, by late 1945, approximately $18 to manufacture. The industrial mobilization required to produce 22 million proximity fuses during the war years was itself a remarkable achievement. Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, McQuay Norris, and dozens of other firms converted production lines and trained workers to assemble these precision devices. At peak production in late 1945, American factories were producing 70,000 fuses daily. For Germany, the mathematical realities became increasingly stark as winter gave way to spring. The Ardennes offensive had failed, consuming irreplaceable reserves of men, armor, and aircraft. Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March, pushing deep into German territory. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's military machine, could barely contest the skies over Germany itself. Oberst Heinrich Baer, one of Germany's top fighter aces with over 200 confirmed victories, found himself commanding a jet fighter unit equipped with Messerschmitt 262s. These revolutionary aircraft, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, represented Germany's last hope for technological superiority in the air. They could outrun any Allied fighter. Their 30mm cannons could destroy heavy bombers with short bursts. In theory, they could turn the tide of the air war. In practice, they faced proximity-focused anti-aircraft fire that made takeoff and landing, the moments when even jets were slow and vulnerable, into lethal gauntlets. Baer watched pilot after pilot, some of Germany's finest, shot down by shells that exploded themselves with uncanny precision as the jets accelerated down runways or lined up for landing approaches. The jet's speed meant nothing when caught at low altitude with insufficient velocity to evade. American intelligence officers, analyzing wreckage and captured documents, began to piece together the full extent of the proximity fuse's impact. From December 1944 through May 1945, the weapon had fundamentally altered the tactical balance. German aircraft that ventured within range of Allied anti-aircraft guns faced odds that made mission success unlikely and survival uncertain. The effectiveness went beyond simple kill ratios. Proximity fuses forced changes in German tactical doctrine that cascaded through their entire air operations. Missions had to be flown at higher altitudes, reducing bombing accuracy. Attack runs had to be faster and shorter, limiting time over target. Evasive maneuvers, now ineffective against proximity fuzzes, consumed fuel and reduced range. The entire calculus of risk and reward tilted decisively against the Luftwaffe. By April of 1945, as Allied armies advanced toward Berlin, German air operations over Western Europe had effectively ceased, not because the Luftwaffe had no aircraft remaining, not because pilots refused to fly, but because the mathematical realities of aerial combat had shifted beyond the point where air operations could achieve meaningful results at acceptable cost. The small device that Technical Sergeant Kincaid had first held in December, the proximity fuse that seemed too delicate to survive its own firing, had helped achieve what years of conventional anti-aircraft fire could not. It had driven the Luftwaffe from the skies over Europe, not through brute force but through mathematical precision, and in doing so, it had demonstrated a principle that would shape military technology for generations to come. The age of smart weapons had begun. The principle that a weapon could sense its environment and adapt its behavior in real time without human intervention had been proven in combat. The vacuum tubes and mechanical components would give way to transistors and then microchips. The radio altimeters would evolve into laser rangers and infrared seekers, but the fundamental concept, established by proximity fuses over Europe in 1944 and 1945, would endure. German panzer crews had learned to fear the 90mm gun when it was mounted on American M36 tank destroyers. German infantrymen had learned to dread proximity-fused artillery, creating perfect airbursts in all weather conditions. Now German pilots had learned that the 90mm anti-aircraft gun, married to proximity fuzzes and radar fire control, represented a weapon system against which traditional evasion tactics were obsolete. The irony was bitter. Germany, which had pioneered so much military technology, had possessed the knowledge to develop proximity fuses in 1940. Hitler's directive to focus on immediate production had seemed pragmatic at the time. Why invest in weapons that wouldn't be ready for years when victory seemed imminent? That decision, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of aircrewmen, had helped seal Germany's fate. The Americans, facing disaster at Pearl Harbor and apparently trailing in military technology, had made the opposite choice. They had invested $1 billion and marshaled an entire scientific and industrial establishment to perfect a weapon that seemed impossible. And they had succeeded just in time to reshape the final year of the war. As May of 1945 arrived and the war in Europe ended, Allied military analysts began examining the proximity fuse's broader implications. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who had watched proximity-fused shells save his carrier task forces from Japanese air attacks, called the fuse as important as radar in achieving victory. General George Patton credited it with saving the Third Army during the Battle of the Bulge. Winston Churchill said it had saved London from the Vosne assault. Technical Sergeant Robert Kincaid returned home to his family in Ohio, his war finally over. He could never speak publicly about the secret weapon he'd helped employ, as the proximity fuse remained classified for years after the war's end. But he knew, as did thousands of other American soldiers who'd witnessed its effectiveness, that they'd operated at the cutting edge of a technological revolution. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun, a conventional weapon by most measures, had been transformed into something unprecedented when coupled with proximity fuses and radar fire control. Together, these technologies created what would later be called a weapons system, multiple components working in concert to achieve effects impossible for any single technology alone. The shells themselves would be retired from service within a decade, replaced by surface-to-air missiles that embodied the proximity fuse principle in even more sophisticated forms. The Nike Ajax, Hawk, and later systems would use radar seekers and electronic brains to intercept targets with precision that would have seemed impossible to the gunners of 1944. But the fundamental lesson remained. In warfare, as in nature, adaptability determines survival. The German Luftwaffe, formidable as it was, had adapted its tactics to counter conventional anti-aircraft fire. They had learned the patterns, exploited the limitations, developed doctrines that worked. When those patterns suddenly changed, when the old limitations no longer applied, the Luftwaffe found itself facing a weapon against which their accumulated experience provided no defense. The proximity fuse represented more than technological advancement. It represented the transformation of human conflict into something increasingly dependent on scientific understanding and industrial capacity. The soldiers' traditional skills, courage, initiative, combat experience, remained essential, but they operated within parameters increasingly determined by technology that only nations with extensive scientific establishments and massive industrial bases could develop and deploy. For Germany, the lesson came too late. For the Allied powers, the success of the proximity fuse validated an approach to warfare that would characterize the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Victory would not come solely from battlefield valor or tactical brilliance. It would come from laboratories and factories, from scientists and engineers, from the ability to transform theoretical knowledge into practical weapons faster than the enemy could respond. The proximity fuze, that milk bottle-sized device that seemed too delicate to function, had done exactly what its designers intended. It had turned near misses into kills, made the invisible visible, given American anti-aircraft gunners the ability to reach out and destroy German aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. In doing so, it had helped write the final chapter of the Luftwaffe's story and demonstrated that sometimes the most decisive weapons are not the biggest or the loudest, but the smartest. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.